Hi, I'm Michelle Segrest, and welcome to the Factory of the Future podcast.
This podcast is inspired by my 3-volume book series on the evolution of modern manufacturing. Each episode features engaging conversations with game-changing experts discussing the processes and innovations that are changing the landscape of modern manufacturing. Thank you so much for listening. Please do me a favor and leave me a 5-star rating on iTunes and take just a couple of seconds to leave a review. And then go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss a single episode. Today, I'm really happy to welcome Jess Kauffman, a consultant with the Everyday Business Resilience Group. Jesse has a successful 17-year career across a broad range of industries. He develops highly effective global corporate business continuity processes and crisis management training for executive leadership teams and large-scale nutrition and pharmaceutical manufacturing facilities such as Mead Johnson Nutrition and AstraZeneca. He has been involved in the R&D new product design for leading companies in the appliance and plastic industries, including some big names that I'm sure you've heard of like Whirlpool, Gladiator, Amana, Sub-Zero, and GE, and others. He is also a proud father. He's a small-scale hay farmer. He's a motorcycle enthusiast, and volunteer youth basketball coach. So he's very well-rounded in addition to his business expertise. With the challenges we've all faced in the past year, it is clear that all businesses need the same capabilities and preparedness that global corporations have been utilizing for years. Risk management and crisis management are already on the minds of large companies, but small companies need to be prepared too. They need to be self-sufficient so that they too can thrive in the face of the unexpected. And this is what we're going to talk about today with Jess. It's a really important topic, so let's get to it. Jess, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Michelle. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to our conversation.
Me too. I want to jump right in. I gave a little bit of background about you and told a little bit about you, but I was wondering if you could give us a little bit more of your professional background and what inspired you to work in manufacturing.
Sure. Started off, seems like a long time ago at this point, as a mechanical engineer doing product design, packaging design for Whirlpool. And while I really enjoyed the engineering work, I realized that I was one of those strange engineers that also likes to work with and talk to people. Engineers, we get a stereotype. We tend to be introverts, and found I was a little different.
Had the opportunity. I think that's true. I agree with that. I've talked to so many engineers. But once you get them talking about engineering, usually they really open up.
Yeah, well, it's like the joke that says, how can you tell an extroverted engineer from an introverted one? The extroverted engineer looks at your shoes when they're talking to you.
That's perfect. Yeah. So you're a mechanical engineer and then you wanted to work closer with people. So what happened then?
Well, I had the opportunity to get into project management and found that that was a really good fit for me. Being able to take an engineering mindset to a team level versus a product or a piece of equipment level, and helping a team of people with all different experiences and backgrounds and specialties come together to execute a big global project was really enjoyable for me. Having that opportunity to help people see that success, I found that I was often what you would call the grease between the gears. I could understand enough from each function and each specialty area to help translate and keep everybody communicating and talking and working together while maintaining that big picture view. And had several successful global projects that we launched at Mead Johnson while I was there, and things you still see on the shelf for the parents out there that are buying formula. And it's such an important product. There's a lot of pride there knowing that we're able to provide that kind of nutrition and meet the needs of infants and moms and dads and people that
I didn't know you did exactly that, but my very best friend is a rep for Mead Johnson, and she goes around to all the hospitals on the Gulf Coast delivering formula. And isn't that a small world?
That's
cool. Exactly what she does, and she loves it.
Yeah, it's such a rewarding, you say a job, but I mean, it's just seeing what you can do for people. It's so rewarding. So after I got in the global project management world, I had an opportunity there at Mead Johnson to get into business continuity. And it really seemed to click with everything that being an engineer, being a project manager, understanding the capital side, how businesses run, and those kind of things, tying it all together. And that's what kind of launched me into my new current focus on business continuity and helping companies with that process along with project management, because there are so many tie-ins and similarities in what you do to execute a project well, and it's so key to growth. But at the same time, you can use those techniques and things for business continuity and crisis preparedness so that when the plan doesn't work out like you expect, you can still adapt and overcome and be successful.
Do you miss anything about being an engineer, or do you still have a little taste of that?
I get a little taste of that on my own and my hobbies between working on equipment at home or building things. And I like to be hands-on, so I get plenty of hands-on design and build in my spare time. It's a never-ending project. And especially
So now
when
it's
people...
now it's a fun thing. It's not a job. It's what you do on the side. I've met so many engineers who started out because they love to work on cars, or they love to repair bicycles, or they love to take TVs apart and put them back together. I think this is a common story among engineers. They get inspired because they realize they're fascinated by how things work, and they want to understand how they work and make them work. It's a typical background, but it's interesting. But you also have a farming background, right?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up farming, but my grandparents on my mom's side and several uncles were all farmers. My dad grew up with farming. And so when I got out of school and started working, my in-laws have horses and they need hay. And next thing you know, we're doing hays. So we have our own fields and we do small square bales, and it's a big thing for horse people because, normally hay is something you see the round bales that you feed cows and whatnot, but horses are very picky. For such a big animal, they are very finicky. And you want nice, high quality, small bales that people can handle and pick up on their own because you're not feeding a whole bunch of them at once. And so we do that for fun. When working in air conditioning during the summer gets boring, we go out on the hottest days of the year and throw 70-pound hay bales for fun.
That does sound like fun. That's really cool. So now you're working for a very interesting company called Everyday Business Resilience Group. So tell me just a little bit about this company and what kind of projects you do for your clients.
Sure. So this is a company that my wife and I started in 2020. And when you think of great times to start companies, 2020 is not usually a year that comes to mind. But February of 2020, we decided that she still works full time for AstraZeneca in their supply chain group. And for me, we got to that decision point where what do we want to do? We have family. We want to, our kids are young. How can we continue to support our community and help? And so this was an area that we found when we talked to friends in small business in the area was nobody does this for small business. It's such a key thing, and it's so common in very large businesses that it just seemed like a great opportunity to be able to provide some support and help in our community and other communities around the country, and to give people tools that can help their businesses succeed. And turns out we got a worldwide case study in the first year of why it's important. So
yeah, no kidding.
It's been a very interesting year.
So aside from the obvious, what was it like starting a business? I mean, you said you started in February. That's like a month before everything shut down. Tell us what that was like.
Sure. Challenging to say the least.
Right.
Luckily, the business is focused on how to deal with challenge and the unexpected. So was able to have a couple initial clients and get them in a great position so that when the pandemic happened, when the shutdown happened, they were able to continue to focus on their own clients and serve their needs versus having to figure out how they themselves were going to survive and make it through. So that's the kind of positive impact we wanted to have. And I think that ripple effect of the work we did there is what we're seeing now with as the world opens back up. People see those examples and think, okay, I'm done treading water. I've kind of got my feet back under me. My business is back ready to serve my clients. So the conversations are happening now. We're seeing a lot more interest because everybody saw it. Everybody got scared by it. We all saw what happened, and people have really responded to that and how important it is.
Right. Nobody expected there to be a pandemic. I mean, this is something that caught everybody by surprise. So now we know that could happen. But what are some of the other kinds of crises that businesses should be prepared for?
if you look at specific events or causes, we see a lot of cyber attack things right now, infrastructure issues and utility outages. Just today, there was a big internet outage for big firms, Amazon and other giant firms that use common vendors or subcontractors for certain aspects of the programming that caused an internet outage. And so that's a really common thing. Severe weather, we're definitely seeing that more. There are a lot of specific events, and that's kind of one of the unique things we try to bring to the table is that we don't want companies to necessarily plan for a specific event. What we really work with our clients is to have them understand what an impact to a key process of their business not being available, what's that do?
Right.
That way, we don't care what causes the interruption. We just know how to work around when that interruption happens.
Okay, so the tools and training and consulting that you do has to do with crisis in general, not any specific crisis. And then
Right.
I guess once the crisis happens, then there are other details that you have to think about.
Yep.
But this is about having a plan for a general crisis, whatever that may be, an interruption in business.
Yeah. As an example, one of my clients in February of last year is a payroll company. And the reason they talked to us was they had a scare where they had a false alarm at their office security system. Thankfully, false alarm, but they realized how tied to their office they are, how much of their information and equipment and key things they need to do what they do are tied to a specific location. And so a big part of developing their business continuity plan and crisis management plan was what can they do offsite? What do they need to be able to do things offsite if they can't do it now? And then how do you work around processes if they have an internet outage or there's a power outage or you can't get to the building? Are there ways to deal with that? And so whenever March came and the shutdowns happened, thankfully they were able to get to their building, but they didn't have to spend any time thinking about how they were going to work through any shutdowns or hiccups. And instead were able to add a lot of value to their clients because they were able to give them more time working on things like PPP loans and all of the questions around that and the stimulus packages instead of trying to just scramble to stay alive themselves.
That's right. Describe for me some of the steps that you have to go through to protect your business and to anticipate the possibility of a crisis. Of course, it's kind of like insurance. You hope you never need it, right?
Right. Yeah, our goal is to keep you from having to call.
It's a good thing to have. You wouldn't not have insurance. So
Yep.
why would you not have a crisis plan?
Exactly. The biggest first step is defining the scope. It depends on the business size. Are you looking for a plan for an entire business? Or if it's a smaller business or if it's a bigger business, are you looking for a plan for a specific part of the organization, specific plant or a specific line within a plant or a function within the plant? You want to make sure the focus is where you're at because at the end of the day, it's a living, breathing document. That's okay. You're not going to get it all at once, but you at least get a baseline and you can build from that and use it in other areas. Once you've got that in place, the vast majority of the work really goes into what we call a business impact analysis. And that's where, like I was saying earlier, we're not trying to figure out what could cause the interruption up front. What we want to know is what happens when line number 9 in your manufacturing floor goes down. Or if you've got an injection molding machine and there's a key bearing for a part of it, what happens if that bearing fails and you don't have a backup? Is there a way to transfer production or otherwise move things? If we have that, the intent then is that you can prioritize what your critical processes are. And that way, when something does happen, you're not scrambling to fix something that's not key to your business at that time. You don't have time to waste in the middle of a crisis. You want to fix what you have to get back up and running. And so you already know what your priority processes are. You've ranked them. You know how to work around. You know where your energy should go.
If a crisis happens, like, for example, the pandemic, we'll just take this because everybody knows what that looks like now. If it happens and you don't have this business impact analysis in place or you don't have a plan in place, do you just throw your hands in the air and quit? Or can you put something together then, or is it too late?
You can make do. It's definitely one of those, it's easier to do it beforehand than in the middle, but a big part of that would be being able to take a second to just really look at, in that crisis, what's the most important thing to focus on.
So it's still about prioritizing, whether you're prepared or not. It's still about making priorities.
Yeah, you'll have to prioritize. It'll just be more on the fly. An easy thing to look at first is, okay, you're a business, so what's the most visible thing that's keeping you from giving a product or a service to your customer base? So if it's a supply chain issue because you don't get the parts you need, then focus on that first. If it's
Right.
a labor shortage issue, okay, now you need to focus on where do you find backup labor? How do you fill that pipeline? So it just depends on what your business focus is. But there are a couple of key things is like many things, look at the money, follow the money, and
Of course.
what drives the money, that should probably be where your focus starts with in an emergency.
That's true in just about every scenario. When you decide, okay, yes, I want to be prepared for a crisis so that my company can survive and get through it and not lose business or lose as little as possible. How long does it take? Like, say somebody calls you and they want a business impact analysis and they want your services. How long does it take to put all that together? I guess it probably depends on the size of the company, but in general, are we talking like years to put this together or months or weeks or a day, or how long does it take?
Like you said, it kind of depends on the complexity, but most small to mid-sized businesses, you're probably looking at anywhere from 20 to 70 hours. So a few days to a couple of weeks, depending on just how many moving parts there are for the business.
I can see how it's an advantage to bring somebody in from the outside because they may see something that you don't see from the inside. Now, sometimes you know your business so well that you don't see the trouble points or the things that could go wrong.
Yeah, it's kind of like going to the doctor. We go to the doctor because they can tell us what we need to work on because we may not know where our issues are. Same thing here. An outside perspective, and that's what we really try to bring to the table is not only an outside perspective, but a comprehensive end-to-end perspective of all aspects of a business and how they tie together. At the end of the day, people are in business because they're doing what they love. They've found a need they can support and provide value to their clients. And we want them to be able to focus on that. And so we can kind of take that load off to help giving people an outside perspective. And no matter who it is, it helps to have somebody come in and poke holes, if you will, in your plans and your processes because it's an eye opener. We get used to the day to day.
Right.
It's easy to get blinders on when you're just doing day to day operations.
Yeah, that's exactly the point I was trying to make. I did it poorly, but that makes perfect sense that somebody else could see these holes that need to be filled. I know that big companies probably have a crisis plan in place. They have risk management and crisis management they're thinking about it, of course. But what are some tips for small to medium-sized companies? What can they do to protect their business? They might not be thinking about this.
Yeah, well, hopefully they've taken a lot of what's happened in this last year and written down, recorded, otherwise captured the learnings they've had from the pandemic and the shutdowns associated with it to know where their weaknesses, where their gaps are in their business. The big part is no matter what they do, doing some kind of an impact analysis just so you know what your priorities are, what your key business processes are. It helps not only in prep for disaster, but it helps you focus on what makes your business successful because the process that's the most critical, chances are that's the one that's the most valuable to your company too. So now you know where to put your efforts in continuous improvement and other standard activities that we see.
That's a really good point to make because it would help you see, okay, if this is a priority in a crisis, it should be a priority right now. What can we do to take care of this particular thing right now? What would you say is an example of a big priority, for example, for a small to medium-sized company? What would be like top 3 their list of priorities? I know it varies, but just in general.
We generally try to break it up into 3 categories of people, place, process. Within those, I usually start with people-intensive processes because at the end of the day, no matter how automated a business is, it's dependent upon people and it's providing a service for people. As far as I know, none of us are working for computers. We don't have robot overlords yet. So it's still
right.
people that we're depending on and working for. And that's really where the value of what we do, no matter what the business is, it's to provide some kind of benefit for a person at some point. So focusing on processes that are like from internally labor intensive, and I know in several of your podcasts, I've heard other guests talk about the importance of a skilled workforce and
of course.
The challenges with knowledge. So if you have a small, medium-sized business and you have some key personnel that have a lot of knowledge and experience, you really need to look at what you can do to share or otherwise capture that knowledge and experience so that should they win the lottery and say, oh, it's been fun, but I'm out, I'm going to the beach, you still got that information available.
Well, and they just retire too. May not win the lottery, but they still may not be here tomorrow. And you have to prepare for that. It's so critical.
And so if you can start with those people processes, that's a good place to begin. Then looking at your clients, how do your clients interact with you? How do they get your product or your service? Look what drives that. Do you have logistics concerns that are unique? Is your product something that's needs refrigeration when it's shipping, or
Right.
is it something that's fragile? Or look at that to see where the risk is, because you want to make sure whatever you're putting out the door is getting to your clients in the best condition possible.
It's interesting that you brought that up, especially when you talk about a pharmaceutical manufacturing company, for example, which you have experience with. If the product gets contaminated during a crisis of some sort, that's a big loss. I've been in manufacturing facilities, the pharmaceutical facilities, where you have to go through several layers of clean room. You have to put on all the stuff, and then you have to go through one place and they blow the fans, and then you go to the next station before you even get to the glassed in place where they're making the products. And so there's so many layers of that. And if there's a crisis of any kind and that is contaminated, that's huge. That's a big loss. They have to have a plan for something like that, right?
Yeah, it's such a big loss from not only just the cost of goods, but the kind of things that you're producing, people depend on.
Oh, of course.
That's what
Yeah.
we would tell people at the AstraZeneca facility was things we made at that facility. They weren't things people were taking because they wanted to. They were
That's
things
right.
people took because they had to. And so it was critical that we made sure we had redundancies in place and we had backups and workarounds for everything in order to ensure that our customer, the end customer, gets the medicine that they need.
How difficult is it to recover after a crisis? If you are not prepared, or even if you are prepared, there's still impact from the crisis. How hard is it to bounce back after some sort of catastrophic event?
Key thing I would say is being upfront with expectations on what returning to normal is. We all heard the overused term new normal for the last year and a half.
Right.
It's really just getting back to operations. And so if you can have a minimum level of operations defined beforehand, it makes it a lot easier to know when you move from crisis mode to normal production mode. Companies that don't take the time to plan up front, you'll see a lingering effect of a crisis. We're even seeing that now, the lingering of, are we done? Are we not done? Are we somewhere in
Right.
between? Because there's not a common defined term of what it is when we're back up to close enough normal operations. If your business is fairly standalone, you'll obviously get there a lot faster. If your business is very dependent on inputs from a lot of suppliers and vendors and outside sources, it's going to take you longer just because you're going to need to make sure that all those other people you depend on are also back up and operational.
When you have something like a pandemic, let's just keep on this theme. What are some of the lessons that can be learned? I say this all the time, that it's not a good thing that it happened. You can never call that pandemic a good thing. But on the other hand, it has changed the way we look at manufacturing. We're safer now. Spreading people apart on the assembly line or wearing masks around other people, maybe that's not such a bad thing. You learn that helps for other reasons, not just to manage the pandemic. So what kind of lessons do you think we can all learn from this past year and what's happening, and particularly with regard to manufacturing?
With manufacturing, especially, and I think with a lot of industries, service industries too, is learning how important it is to have leave that lets people stay home when they're sick. It's so critical, and it's easy to take for granted that, oh, it's just a cold, you can come in and work. But, how much harder is it on people, even beyond the pandemic, with flu or with
That's
when
right.
kids are sick, things like that, just trying to plan for that so that employees and workers know that if they're sick, it's okay to stay home. It's okay to heal up, and structuring for that up front so that people are willing to do it. There's no concerns of, oh, I have to go in. I can't
That's
stay
right.
home.
Well, we've all been to meetings that we thought were critical when we were sick. And next thing you know, 5 people that were at that meeting were sick. And I'm not talking about a deadly pandemic. I'm talking about a cold or a flu or just some sort of simple illness. And that affects the company. And we've certainly learned that we can communicate. We can go to meetings and not actually be in the room and still be super productive. So, I think that's one of the lessons we've learned, is how we can communicate without being in person.
Yeah, that flexibility aspect of it.
Flexibility. Yeah. So you can go to the meetings if you feel okay, but if there's a reason you don't need to go, then that's okay too. You can still attend and be there and be productive and be a part of it, be a part of the conversation.
Yeah, and it's okay. It's okay to do a remote meeting when previously it may have been something that company culture says everyone should be there. We've seen that you don't have to be in person for everything. It's okay if it's just an information sharing or you're just looking for quick decisions, those kind of things. Remote or otherwise non-direct contact meetings are actually fairly efficient and save you time and money because you're not trying to collect people into one place.
I think they're actually more efficient in some ways because there's a focus and you're not standing around having a cup of coffee, talking a little bit beforehand. There's not a lot of
Yeah.
chit chat going on. You just turn on the Zoom. I mean, that's a bad thing in one way because we want to be friendly with our colleagues, of course. But if you want to have an effective, productive, efficient meeting, this is not a bad way to do it. And there's fewer distractions and you can mute people, if only one person needs to be talking at the time. I mean, I think there's some advantages there and we've learned this. We've learned how to use this technology. So I definitely think that's one lesson we've learned from a crisis. And I know there are others. One thing I wanted to talk to you about in particular was supply chain. This has had a big effect on manufacturing, as you know. Can you talk a little bit about this, how supply chains can be affected by a crisis?
One of those things that, as we've seen manufacturing move through phases, the just-in-time manufacturing process, you could say, came from the Japanese model of manufacturing, where you are able to have only as many parts as you need to make whatever you need right at that time. That's spread throughout and it's delivered huge efficiencies. But the flip side risk to that is that when you have no inventory, it means you have no backup.
Right.
And I think that's something that companies are going to be able to make that justification from an accounting standpoint, that the inventory carrying costs they were trying to reduce as much as possible are actually cheaper. And each company will have to make that calculation themselves, but increasing that inventory carrying cost in order to have some backup in your supply chain is cheaper than not being able to get a product out the door. The loss of a customer or a sale is so much more expensive.
Oh, of course. And that's part of the crisis plan too, right? Isn't that part of the impact analysis that you do? You have to consider that.
Yeah, you want to look up and down your supply chain. You can't just say, oh, that company's big, they'll be fine. You want to know what their continuity plans are. What do they have in place?
Right.
So
how's
that
it affected them? Their ripple
is.
effects, right? So how has it affected your suppliers? That could be shut down.
Yeah. You look at the chip shortage and how something that people would take for granted shut down and slowed so many manufacturing industries, from cars to computers. How many things have chips in them now that you may have never thought of beforehand?
What do you think is the one thing that most companies overlook when they're planning for a crisis?
That's a good question. I think probably the biggest thing is, will they have the right people and knowledge in place to navigate the crisis?
Yeah.
It's easy to take for granted that you'll be able to just work through, but in a crisis, you want to make sure the people that are guiding you through that have the talents and the skill sets needed for that kind of a thing.
I guess you have to plan for things like panic or disorganization, or not be able to find things that you need in an efficient way. So you do need to have skilled people managing that crisis. It makes perfect sense. I hadn't even thought about that. The personality of the people in charge during a crisis, it sets the tone for the whole thing, right?
Yeah. When you put your plan together, you're specifying not what the general process is. You have specific people that you're identifying for roles within that crisis response team. And you want to have a name and phone numbers and contact info, because in the middle of a crisis, you don't want to say, who do I call? VP of engineering. Who's that? Bob. Bob retired. Oh, crap. Who's the new VP of engineering? You want names and phone numbers so you can reach out to them. And you want those people to know up front, because you might have somebody that in day-to-day operations, they're amazing. But in a crisis situation, they may panic. They may not want to do that. They may tell you up front, I can't do that. I stressed out. I can't do it. Mm-hmm. Well, you don't want to assign them then to be a crisis lead if they're not going to be able to do that job. And so if you can look at that up front and identify it, it just makes life a lot easier.
I'm sure the opposite is true as well. There's some people who are kind of quiet during day to day, but in a crisis, they really come through. So I bet companies have to consider that too when they're assigning, especially when they're assigning ownership of responsibility when the crisis happens.
Yeah, you could see people that seem very laid back and relaxed in day-to-day operations and might be considered, oh, well, they're not out there just cramming and going, doing everything they can. But in a crisis situation, that's kind of what you want is somebody that's going to be a little calmer. I think it's a Navy SEAL saying where slow is smooth and smooth is fast. And
Right.
just because you're not rushing doesn't mean you're not moving as quickly as you can. Knowing where those talents and those skill sets are, that's a big part of it.
I'm really curious. At what point do you know you're in a crisis? For example, if a tornado comes through and blows your building away, you know. In other situations, it's more of a slow burn, right? So
Yeah.
are there warning signs? Is there a key indicator? How do you know that it's time to go into crisis management?
If you've gone through the process, you'll have trigger points where either something is down for a certain number of days or minutes, depending on the process. That's kind of one of the key things of that business impact analysis is understanding how long a process can be interrupted before it starts to cost you money, cost you time, or cost you reputation. That's what you're trying to quantify. You can put numbers on those things to then know, okay, if our internet's down for 10 minutes, that's a problem. If you're a banking company, that's an issue when now you can't do the transactions you need to do. So you can enact a plan that you've developed. If you don't have a plan in place, I think it's as soon as you realize that your pocketbook's getting impacted, quick turnaround time to say, okay, we're in crisis. Time
Once
to
again, follow
go
the
into
money.
emergency mode. Yeah, follow the money.
Always follow the money. I think that's a good rule of thumb, probably. I want to talk a little bit more about small to medium-sized companies and how they can handle a big crisis because they don't have as much resources. They don't have as many people. What are some tips for them specifically to really put a plan in place that works when they don't have a big budget to enact something major?
Yeah, when you don't have the overhead to have a dedicated team or person to handle that for you, it becomes a little trickier. I think a big part of that is in the small to mid-sized business world, networking is so key to growing your business and doing the type of things that a business needs to operate. It's also key to knowing who you can reach out to in an emergency. So if you can build that network out between your own vendors and suppliers and clients and support businesses and document it, make some basic lists of who you need for key inputs to your business. Who do you need in order to sell your product or service? Having those so that at the very least, when something happens, you've got a name and a number, somebody you can call or email, reach out to.
That's good advice. That makes perfect sense. So I asked you earlier, how do you know when you're in a crisis? How do you know when the crisis is over?
That is I'd say it's a flexible answer.
Okay. Well, just give me an example maybe of.
Depends on the business. But if you've got a minimum average, let's say cash flow or other standard of operations throughput that you're measuring, and that tells you on a normal day or a normal week or whatever, we put out this many widgets or, we have this many clients come through, that kind of thing. I'd like to say the 80-20 rule, but really for back to normal, you probably drop it back to 70-30, 60-40. If you're back up to about 60-70% of whatever that average normal metric would be, that's when you're close enough that you can move out of crisis mode and then just into the repair and maintain mode.
Recovery mode. Even then, are you kind of teetering a little bit? Because if you're only 60% back, can it still go the other way if you're not careful?
It can if you're not careful. The risk factor is that if you leave it in crisis mode, while there are a few people out there that are special and can live in crisis mode at all times, most people, eventually it will burn you out, whether you're the business owner or a manager or lead, the people getting the work done on the floor. You've got to at some point dial it back down to semi-normal operations just to give people a chance to even get a mindset back into what recovery looks like. I think that's kind of the rest. I like to work out and stay in shape, but that's one of the things that people forget a lot is if you work out all the time and never rest, you're not going to get stronger and in better shape. And it's the same for a business where if you just stay in crisis mode and you don't have a target that says at this point, I will at least take it out of crisis mode and go back to more of a normal operations, you run the risk of not getting back to normal operations because you've stopped looking down the line further into the future and instead are just focused on that day-to-day emergency. Jeopardize your chances of getting back into a growth mode because you're so focused on right now. We've all seen what happens when you get trapped in a cycle of right now. It becomes very hard to make decisions that are good for you in the year plus range to grow your business.
Do most companies call you when they want to create a crisis management plan, or do you approach them? And if you approach them, how do you approach them? What do you say? Just in case your building burns down, you should have this plan. What is your sales pitch to let them know that this is something they need?
For me, it's a little bit of both. So I do a lot of outreach and education, seminars, webinars, things like that, putting together programs for people to just educate and show how they can start doing some of these foundational elements, the tools themselves. And then it becomes a question of when companies come to me, they've either had a crisis that cost them significant time, money, or reputation, and they say, that was awful. I'd rather not do that again. Can you help us make sure we don't have to deal with it? And so you have that, or they see that, okay, not only is my business more prepared if we go through this, but like we said earlier, because of the way this allows you to quantify what your critical business processes are, it makes your business more efficient. It helps you increase your margins because now you know where your business, what it depends on to do the things you need to do to stay in business. And so it's kind of like the tools you use for continuous improvement or Kaizen or lean. Usually people think of crisis management as avoiding risk, but really it's identifying where to apply those tools. Because if you have a critical process, this manufacturing line is our most important one. That also tells you that's where we're going to focus all of our continuous improvement efforts on, because we know we need it to not only be available at all times, but we know we need it to be the most efficient.
And this may be a stupid question, but what is the difference between risk management and crisis management?
So risk management is proactive, planning ahead, trying to figure out what your risk is, like what processes are at risk or have issues, and then mitigating those. Crisis management is that in the moment, something's happened.
Okay. So risk management is more about having a mindset of what could go wrong and how do we not let that happen?
Yep.
And crisis management is more of an actual event?
Yeah. So in project management, there's a lot of, when you're doing a project plan, you do a risks and issues identification. And it's kind of like the risks are things that might happen. Mm-hmm. Issues are things that are happening or have happened. Okay. And that's kind of where the crisis management is. You're dealing with something that has happened.
And then you have to go in specific mode of handling that specific crisis.
Yep.
But the plan in the beginning has nothing to do with specifics. It's just a plan. You have to have a plan in place for whatever the crisis looks like. And then you make the adjustments depending on the crisis, right?
Yeah. So if you know what the interruptions are going to cost you, then you can start that brainstorming process to say what could cause the interruption. And that's where you get into that more specifics. Are we in a floodplain? Do we live on the coast and hurricanes come through?
Right.
What's a hurricane do? Well, it causes flooding, can cause power outages, damage from wind, all those things. Do we live near an earthquake place or things like that? You can start looking at once you've identified where your risks are within the business.
This is really interesting. I'm learning a lot. I'm really enjoying this conversation. It wasn't an area of expertise for me, so I was really happy to learn a lot more. I do want to ask you, just because the podcast is about the future, what do you think, from your perspective, what does the factory of the future look like?
From what I've seen and just thinking how things are going, I think we're going to see a continued move towards more automation. With that being said, I think that's where we're going to see an upskilled workforce, and it's going to have to be a workforce that's trained within the community that the factory is located. You can automate simple tasks, but in order to work on the robots or the things that are doing the automated work, you need a highly skilled person to be able to go in and do that, to repair or make changes or set them up. So I think you're going to see a growth of both the automation, but also just the skill level of your normal workforce.
I think that's really a common perspective. I think a lot of people are thinking like you're thinking, that part has to be taken care of. I think that's something we definitely all agree on. There's no question.
Yeah.
This has really been fun. As I said before, I think it's a fascinating conversation. I'm really grateful that you were here. I do want to give you a chance to have the last word, kind of sum things up and just give us some final thoughts.
Sure. So at the end of the day, when I look at why I got into the risk management world, is that I know most companies, they like to focus on the growth and the efficiency and how can we make things better. And I see this as a way to not only make things better, but also to prepare you for when things do go wrong. At some point, something's going to happen. None of us have been through life with nothing, no bumps or scrapes or bruises or anything. And if you're prepared for that, it lets you take advantage of being back up and running before your competitors. It's just an example of a local manufacturer where somebody I know, they make a small electronic part for router communications. And when the supply chains went wonky this last few months, they had enough parts in-house and they make them from scratch that they were able to take up a lot of their competitors' business just because they had the parts there and were able to do it. So helping people do that is what we want to do. And it's all about, as we've seen, the world's crazy. So the more we can prepare for it, the better off we'll all be.
I think that's another thing we can all agree on. And what's the old saying? Prepare for the worst and expect or hope for the best. What's that saying?
Yeah.
This is kind of what this crisis management is. Prepare for the worst, hope for the best. I think that's it.
Yep.
It's great having you here today, Jess. Thanks so much for your time and for, of course, your expertise. And we'll put some links to your website and your social media and some more information about your company in the show notes so people can give you a call and create a crisis management plan.
Great. Well, thank you, Michelle. I appreciate having the chance to visit with you and the work you're doing. That's
Thanks
great
so much.
Information.
It's super fun. Thanks for being here. This brings us to the end of the show. Thank you so much for listening. Please do me a favor and subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on iTunes. If you have interesting information to share and want to contact me about being a guest on a future episode of this podcast, please send me an email at michelle@navigatecontent.com. You can also send me questions that I will have my expert guests answer for you on a future episode. And in the meantime, please check out my book series on modern manufacturing to read more than 30 real-world case studies about how global companies are using smart technology and innovation to build the factory of the future. All the links to the books and articles mentioned in this podcast are in the show notes. Have a great week, and please join me for the next episode of Factory of the Future.